Let me be honest with you about something that nobody in the productivity space wants to admit. Last year, I locked my phone in a drawer for 48 hours, ate nothing but water and rice crackers, and sat in a dim room staring at a wall because a guy with a ring light and a podcast told me my dopamine was broken. And you know what happened? I emerged from that experience like a feral raccoon discovering an open dumpster. I watched 6 hours of YouTube, ordered 4 things I didn't need, and spent the next 3 days convincing myself I just needed to do the detox harder next time. If that sounds familiar, I want you to know something important before we go any further. You didn't fail the dopamine detox. The dopamine detox failed you, and I can prove it, because I now have the brainwave data to show exactly what happened inside your skull, and it is not what any of those gurus told you. Here's the screenshot you're looking at right now. This is my prefrontal cortex activity measured across 3 separate mornings. Morning 1, post-monk mode. Morning 2, post the protocol I'm going to teach you today. The difference is not subtle. This isn't branding, this isn't a vibe. This is electroencephalography, and the gap between those 2 lines is the gap between you white-knuckling your way through Tuesday and you actually choosing what your brain pays attention to. Now I need to talk to some specific people in this room, because not everyone watching this has the same brain, and the productivity industry absolutely refuses to acknowledge that. If you currently have between 3 and 14 unfinished projects open on your laptop, if you've started a podcast, a newsletter, a drop shipping store, a Notion template business, and a novel in the past 18 months, if someone has ever looked at your browser tabs and audibly gasped, then your brain is not broken. It is not lazy. It is not a discipline problem. You are running what researchers call a multipotentialite processing style, and the entire architecture of hustle culture was built for a completely different cognitive profile. Telling your brain to just focus on one thing is like telling a jazz musician they'd play better if they just learned one note. The advice isn't wrong because you're bad at following it. The advice is wrong because it was never designed for how you're actually wired. So here is what this video is going to do for you. We are going to walk through what I call the Neuro-Autonomy Protocol, a 3-step system for reprogramming your dopamine response in 7 days, not by starving your brain of stimulation, but by teaching your prefrontal cortex to be the one holding the steering wheel. But before we get to the protocol, you need to understand why the old method doesn't just fail, why it actively makes the problem worse. And this part is going to require me to say something mildly heretical about the entire wellness influencer economy of the last 5 years.
Dopamine detox, as a concept, is neurologically incoherent. I don't mean it's ineffective. I mean the premise that you can flush or reset dopamine from your brain through abstinence is not a thing that exists in biology. Dopamine is not a toxin. It is not a substance that accumulates like cholesterol in an artery. It is a neurotransmitter, which means it is a molecule your brain synthesizes and reabsorbs in microseconds to regulate motivation, movement, and reward anticipation. If your dopamine levels genuinely dropped to 0, you would not feel refreshed and clear-headed. You would develop Parkinson's disease. This is not a metaphor. The defining feature of Parkinson's is the destruction of dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra. So when a wellness creator tells you that sitting in silence for 24 hours will detox your dopamine, what they're actually describing is a neurological disorder. The framing is not just wrong, it's spectacularly, almost impressively wrong. What is actually happening when you force yourself into a day of cold turkey abstinence from every form of stimulation is something far more interesting and far more counterproductive. Your amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, doesn't recognize the difference between "I'm doing a productivity ritual" and "resources are suddenly scarce." It registers absence of reward cues as a survival threat. So your stress, cortisol, rises.
Your brain begins what neuroscientists call a compensatory upregulation of dopamine receptors. Essentially, it makes itself more sensitive to stimulation to prepare for the eventual re-exposure. This is why the moment your detox ends, you don't return to baseline. You binge. You don't watch one YouTube video, you watch 11. You don't scroll for 10 minutes, you scroll for 2 hours. And the whole time, a small, confused part of your brain is asking, wasn't I just doing a thing to prevent this? Yes, you were. And the thing you were doing was physiologically designed to produce exactly this outcome. This is the rebound effect, and it has been documented in behavioral neuroscience research on reward restriction going back decades. The harder you clamp down with willpower, the more violently the spring uncoils when the clamp comes off. Willpower, it turns out, is not a muscle you can train indefinitely. It is a finite cognitive resource governed by the prefrontal cortex, and every act of raw suppression depletes it. The hustle culture gurus who told you to just want it more, to wake up at 4 in the morning and grind through discomfort, they were asking you to fight your nervous system with your nervous system, which is roughly as effective as trying to put out a fire with a slightly smaller fire. So how do we actually fix this? We'll start right now with step 1 of the protocol, and I promise you, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do takes less than 5 minutes and requires nothing except a window and a floor to stand on.
Step 1 begins not at your desk, not in front of your productivity app, and not with a cold plunge that you've been putting off for 3 weeks. It begins the moment your alarm goes off, before you touch your phone, before you open a single app, before your brain has been handed any synthetic input whatsoever. What I want you to do in the first 5 minutes of waking is walk to the nearest window, or better yet, outside, and expose your eyes to natural light while doing what Andrew Huberman's lab at Stanford has been refining for years, and what the Navy SEALs have been using under a different name for decades: non-sleep deep rest, or NSDR. You're not meditating, you're not journaling, you're not doing breath work with a gong track in the background. You are simply lying still, eyes closed, not trying to sleep, while your nervous system does something extraordinary that it cannot do while you're scrolling or thinking about your to-do list. It offloads the previous session's cognitive residue. It restores dopamine in the striatum, which is the brain region responsible for motivation and drive, by as much as 65%, according to research out of the Weissman Institute. 65%. That is not a rounding error. That is the difference between the version of you who sits down to work and immediately opens Reddit, and the version of you who sits down and actually begins. The sunlight component is not optional, and it is not aesthetic. When short wavelength light from the morning sun, ideally within 30 to 45 minutes of waking, hits the melanopsin-containing retinal ganglion cells in your eyes, it triggers a cortisol pulse that is not the stress cortisol you're thinking of. This is a sharp, clean, early morning cortisol spike that sets your circadian rhythm, suppresses melatonin for the day, and, critically, calibrates your dopamine baseline for the next 16 hours. Miss this window consistently, and your dopamine system will spend the entire day operating slightly below its natural set point, which means everything difficult will feel slightly more impossible than it needs to, and everything easy and stimulating will feel slightly more irresistible than it should. You are not weak. You are vitamin D deficient and circadian disrupted, and your phone figured that out before your doctor did. So the full Step 1 protocol looks like this. Alarm goes off, no phone, 10 minutes of morning light. You can walk, you can stand, you can drink coffee, this is not a punishment, followed by 5 to 10 minutes of NSDR, which you can find guided versions of for free. No app subscription required. That's it. That is the entire first step. Under 20 minutes, zero equipment, and your prefrontal cortex will have more available glucose and more dopamine precursor availability before you've even opened your laptop than it would have had after an entire day of monk mode. Step 1 is not about discipline. It is about giving your brain the biological conditions it needs to choose hard things voluntarily.
Which brings us to the problem that step 1 alone cannot solve. And if you have the multipotentialite brain we talked about earlier, you already know exactly what's coming. Focus, once restored, is only half the equation, because here is the specific, maddening torture of the high-novelty brain. You regain your concentration, you sit down with genuine intention, and then within 40 minutes, you are no longer working on the thing you sat down to work on. You have opened a new tab. You have started outlining a different project. You have begun mentally drafting a pivot. This is not distraction in the clinical sense. Your brain is not broken. It is doing something that, in a pre-industrial context, would have made you extraordinarily valuable. It is pattern matching across domains, connecting ideas that live in separate silos, scanning for novelty, because novelty, in evolutionary terms, meant survival. The problem is that the modern economy largely rewards depth in a single lane, and your brain is a 6-lane highway that wants to run traffic in all directions simultaneously.
The worst advice you could receive at this point, and I'm going to say this directly because someone is going to put it in the comments, is to just pick one thing and commit. I know, I've heard it, I've tried it, and if you have a scanner brain, that advice doesn't make you more productive. It makes you quietly miserable and then secretly resentful of the one thing you picked, which eventually kills your motivation for it entirely. Step 2 of the Neuro-Autonomy Protocol is not about narrowing. It is about architecture. Specifically, it's about a technique I call cross-pollination scheduling, which comes out of research on what cognitive scientists call interleaving, the counterintuitive finding that practicing multiple related skills in alternating blocks produces better long-term retention and performance than practicing one skill in a single deep block.
Here's how it works in practice. Instead of fighting your brain's desire to context switch, you build deliberate switch points into your day. You work in 90-minute blocks. This aligns with your ultradian rhythm, the natural 90 to 120-minute oscillation of alertness that your brain runs on whether you schedule around it or not. And across those blocks, you rotate between no more than 3 active projects, not 30, 3. The multipotentialite's failure mode isn't that they have too many interests, it's that they have no container for them. Cross-pollination gives you the container. Project A for 90 minutes, a 10-minute transition ritual. This can be a walk, a set of push-ups, 5 minutes of the NSDR you learned in Step 1, and then Project B. What you will find within about a week of running this structure is that the insights you generate in Project A start showing up as solutions in Project B. This is not a coincidence. This is your default mode network, the brain's background processing system, doing exactly what it was designed to do when you give it deliberate transition time instead of filling every gap with a phone screen. Hassan Minhaj wrote 3 simultaneous comedy formats while producing a news show. Elon Musk, whatever your feelings about him, runs 7 companies by rotating attention in structured blocks, not by achieving monk-like singular focus. Maya Angelou wrote poetry, memoir, screenplays, and music, not sequentially, but in parallel, using what she described as deliberate creative separation between disciplines. These are not people who succeeded despite their inability to focus on one thing. They built systems that let their multi-threaded brains operate at full capacity instead of in a cage. You are not a liability. You are an asset that's been handed the wrong operating instructions. But I need to warn you about something, because if I don't, you will hit day 4 of this protocol and conclude that it has stopped working, and you will quit, and I will have failed you. On approximately the 4th day, sometimes the 3rd, occasionally the 5th, but almost always in that window, your brain will produce what I can only describe as a full-spectrum mutiny. The projects that felt exciting on day 1 will feel tedious. The morning light routine will feel pointless. You will have the overwhelming, physiologically convincing sensation that this system is not for you specifically, that everyone else who tried it had something you don't, and that the most rational thing to do is simply open TikTok and decompress for a while. This is not a character flaw. This is your amygdala, which has been monitoring your new behavioral pattern, recognizing that the old dopamine shortcuts are being rerouted and firing a threat response to bring you back to baseline. It feels like boredom. It feels like evidence. It is neither. It is a neurological habit loop fighting for its survival, and step 3 is specifically designed for this exact moment. What you're going to do at the first sign of that day 4 wall is something called temptation bundling, a strategy developed by behavioral economist Catherine Milkman at Wharton, and the evidence behind it is some of the cleanest in the behavioral science literature. The principle is elegantly simple. You pair the activity you need to do with a form of sensory pleasure you only allow yourself during that activity. Milkman's original study found that people who could only listen to their favorite audiobooks while at the gym increased their gym attendance by 51% compared to controls. Your brain is not refusing to do hard things because it hates hard things. It's refusing because hard things have a weaker immediate dopamine signal than easy things, and your nervous system is running a cost-benefit calculation in real time. Temptation bundling doesn't trick the calculation, it changes the inputs. You make the hard thing the only place the pleasurable thing lives, and suddenly the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system are pulling in the same direction instead of arm wrestling. If you run this protocol for 30 days, not perfectly, not without slipping, but consistently enough that the new neural pathways have time to myelinate, your relationship with effort will be physiologically different, not metaphorically, not motivationally, structurally. The prefrontal to striatal connections that govern voluntary goal pursuit will be measurably stronger on a brain scan. You will begin to experience what researchers describe as intrinsic motivation reemergence, the spontaneous desire to work on hard things, not because you've disciplined yourself into it, but because your reward system has been recalibrated to find the process itself satisfying. You will crave the work, not every day, not perfectly, but reliably enough that it will feel like a different brain than the one you had when you started. This protocol will restore your focus and rebuild your drive. But I have to tell you something uncomfortable before you close this video. There are 3 things you are almost certainly doing every night that are silently and measurably eroding your prefrontal cortex, shrinking the exact structure this entire protocol depends on. And if you don't stop them, every gain you make during the day will be quietly dismantled while you sleep. To find out what those 3 habits are and exactly how to eliminate them, click on this video right now. I'll see you there.